Union troops right outside of Richmond, threatening Richmond. And if your friends are anything like my friends, they'll say, well, no, I didn't know that, but really, can we talk about something other than the Civil War? So, but anyway, you have that takeaway. Some friends may be amazed. We'll see. So, all right. So the little roadmap here, so we know where we are over the next 3 hours, and the things that we're going to talk about. So we're talking about this. This is a military book. This is about a military operation outside Richmond. I'm going to try to provide context, why it happened, what happened, that kind of thing. And so we will start by talking a little bit about Robert E. Lee and his decision to move up into Pennsylvania from Virginia in the summer of 1863 that kicked off the Gettysburg Campaign. And then we'll talk a little bit about the response from the Federal High Command, particularly a plan hatched by Henry Halleck to kind of counteract, kind of a counterblow to what Lee is doing, and a little-known plan from Halleck. We'll talk a little bit about the troops that were in Eastern Virginia and Richmond at the time that this happened. So this is all in June and July of 1863. And we'll talk about the offensive itself, which was conducted by a general named John Dix. Most people that know him at all know him because there's a fort named after him, Fort Dix. And that includes, there were kind of 3 prongs to that. It's a cavalry raid, and then there's a very large infantry raid that kind of has 2 columns to that. So there were things that were happening outside of Richmond. If we have time, or maybe during the Q&A, or maybe afterwards if people have questions, there also were some interesting Confederate diplomatic efforts going on at the time. I'm not sure we'll have time for that. And then we'll kind of wrap it up and see what it all means. So we'll jump into this, but before we do, so when I give this talk, I give this talk at round tables, very knowledgeable people about the Civil War, and I'll kind of look around and I'll talk about, well, there were 20,000 men outside of Richmond, and I see like some puzzled looks. People are like, what? This is an obscure topic, okay? Not a lot of people know a lot about this, but I want to put everyone at ease, but it's a spoiler alert, and the spoiler alert is, no, the Federals did not capture Richmond during the Gettysburg Campaign. So everybody can just, we'll just put that aside. And that may kill the suspense for some people, but I just want to make sure so no one's confused about that. All right, so slides. Excellent. All right. Okay, so let's start with the familiar. So in June 1863, Lee heads up north from Virginia with his army that kicks off what we will become to known as the Gettysburg Campaign. And in doing so, he's seeking to seize the initiative and put the U.S. troops on their heels. And there are lots of different reasons why Lee does this, and you look in studies, you'll see a list of them, and people argue about them. But the things that are kind of put out there are, the reason that he decides to leave the Virginia front, he's at Fredericksburg, north of Richmond, and go up into Pennsylvania or toward Pennsylvania, it's because he wants to gain supplies for his army, and he also wants to depress Northern morale and reap political benefits in the elections that are, going to be coming up in the next few years. He wants to relieve Central Virginia from the ravages of war, and he also wants to protect Richmond, and he thinks the most effective way of protecting Richmond is to put the is to kind of take the initiative against the Federals. Also, you see discussion of he wants to seek a decisive military victory. He's hoping to string out the Army of the Potomac and kind of defeat it in detail. So, and then there's also the issue of that's always kind of looming there of trying to gain foreign recognition. All right, have I gone all the way forward here? I think I have. My finger must have been on it. Oh, here we go. Yeah. Is there a way to get back to the beginning without me? Oh, good. Excellent. I apologize for that. Okay. All right. So this map here, and I'm going to move my notes away from this so this doesn't happen again. All right. So this map here, it shows you where the basically Lee moving north. Now, this is a map from the book, and it's kind of squished because the slides were made sideways. But for this talk, since no one can see that, and this is always a thing with talks about military stuff, people look at the maps and they're like, I can't see anything. I made maps that are a little simpler, but still I'm sure some people can't see that either. But anyway, this is Lee heading up into and north into Maryland and Pennsylvania. But so we talked about kind of the familiar, but let's talk about something that's not as familiar, and that's Lee's supply line during the campaign. What is going on? What is his connection to Richmond? Is he just floating up there in Pennsylvania? You know, what is his logistical tail, if you will? And Lee's army does a lot of foraging in Pennsylvania. Food is not a huge problem, but during the campaign, he's maintaining this connection with Richmond via these railroads, which are the dark red connection there, and then some wagon roads, essentially, from two rail heads, Stanton and Culpeper. And so during the campaign, he uses these to bring ammunition up to his army. He's also he's shuttling troops back and forth. There are not a lot of records on the supply situation at the time, but if you piece things together, you see that he has this connection that is highly vulnerable during the campaign. And so this vulnerability is something that the Federals recognized, and particularly Henry Halleck, who is at the time, he's the general-in-chief. He's kind of the middle manager of operations, U.S. operations in Washington at the time. Halleck is, a fairly well-known figure in the war. And he had gained some victories out west early. He was promoted to this position, general-in-chief. And from his desk in Washington, he sought to kind of coordinate the movements of the U.S. forces. And so Halleck, very intelligent guy, very hard worker, but also some people saw problems with Halleck, and particularly they saw that he had a corrosive tendency to indecision. So he seemed to operate as kind of a capable middle manager, but he did not provide much direction to the officers in the field. Now, some people argue about whether that was a good thing or a bad thing, but generally Halleck was seen as not kind of living up to his promise when he took this role. But when Lee goes up into Pennsylvania, this is a crisis for the folks in Washington, and Halleck, they're coordinating a response. But Halleck develops this kind of counterblow strategy that is not very well known, and that's to essentially try to hit this supply line that Lee has, hurt his supply line, damage his logistical tail. And so he develops this idea for three prongs. And one is to go against Richmond from the forces that are east of Richmond. Another is to take the forces in West Virginia and hit the rail line that connects Richmond to Tennessee. And the other is to hit the Wilmington and Weldon Railroad right nearby here from the garrison at Newbern at the time. And so this is in 1863, and the Federals, their main base is down there in Newbern. So, okay. So that's this Halleck kind of counterblow plan. And in Virginia, the instructions he gives in Virginia are, and I'm just going to read these because they become important in the way things happen here. And he tells the commander in Virginia, he says, all your available force should be concentrated to threaten Richmond, by seizing and destroying their railroad bridges over the South and North Anna rivers, and do them all the damage possible. Now, interestingly, I said that comma out loud because in official records, the comma's there, but when you look at the dispatch in archives, the comma's not there. What the recipient actually was reading, I'm not sure, but this was a little vague and would cause some problems. But so who receives this order from Halleck? It's this guy, John Dix, who commands the Department of Virginia. Okay, so John Dix is not a household name, and when you're reading about the Civil War, he commanded this department that was pretty much based at Fort Monroe. They had troops in Norfolk, they had troops at Yorktown, they had troops around that area for a time at Suffolk. About 30,000 men, a fairly large force east of Richmond, and it was commanded by this guy, John Dix. And John Dix is kind of viewed, to the extent he is viewed at all, as one of the quintessential political generals. And he had actually served in the Army as a youth during the War of 1812. In the Civil War, he was in his 60s. And between the War of 1812 and the Civil War, he had a pretty extraordinary career of private and public service. He worked, he represented his state at the state and at the federal level, and he had a bunch of positions in the private sector, and he was also a Democrat, so he was a good asset for the Lincoln administration because John Dix was a Democrat who was very supportive of the war. He was very pro-war, and this was an important person for Lincoln to keep close and to support. And so the other thing about Dix is that at the very beginning of the secession crisis, he was head of the Treasury Department, and part of the Treasury Department are managing the revenue cutters at different spots. And as the Confederate forces were seizing the U.S. installations at these various places in the South, he sent a message to his folks in New Orleans and the Treasury officials there, and he said, if anyone attempts to haul down the American flag, shoot him on the spot. And this became something that was in all the papers. They even made little tokens that had this statement on it. And I spoke out in Denver to the round table out there, and one of the guys from the round table actually had 2 of these tokens. I had never seen them in real life. It was pretty interesting to look at them. One of them, though, actually had a typo in it, which was kind of interesting, but, So anyway, all right, so that's Dix. That's who's in charge. Halleck. Lee's going into Pennsylvania. Halleck develops this kind of plan, this counter-blow plan. Seems pretty interesting, right? Potential here. And so what does Dix do? What does he think about? So he takes 20,000 of his 30,000 men, and he goes up the York River and then the Pamunkey, and he establishes a base at White House Landing. White House Landing happened to be the plantation owned by one of Robert E. Lee's sons, Rooney Lee. It was also the base used by McClellan during the Peninsula Campaign in 1862. But sometime during that campaign, the house, Rooney Lee's house, was burned down. So when Dix arrived there wasn't very much of the White House plantation left there. But the White House is it's an important spot because it has this secure water connection because the Federals controlled the waterways here, back to supplies and what have you, but it was also very close to Richmond. So this was an ideal spot. And so Dix, he has those orders I read, burn some bridges, threaten Richmond. There's something about that in there, and depends on where you put the comma and everything. And so his basic options are, do I attack Richmond directly, or do I go after the railroad bridges? And the railroad bridges, so we saw those red lines earlier in the map you couldn't see. And then here on the map, you can't see, there are other red lines, but these are there are two rail lines headed north from Richmond, and they cross this river, the South Anna River here, and there are two fairly large bridges there. And so this was the target. If we burn those bridges, if Dix, and his people burn those bridges, then that cuts the railroad to Lee for the most part. And so he decides as he holds several councils of war, and we generally know, how that goes. They don't make a decision. They have another meeting, and then they finally decide, well, we're not going to take the aggressive action. We're not going to go after Richmond. There was little enthusiasm, and part of it was due to the fact that they really didn't know what was happening at Richmond. So you have Dix, 20,000 men, about 20 miles outside of Richmond, trying to decide what to do. Lee and the bulk of, the Army of Northern Virginia, the bulk of the forces, Confederate forces in Virginia, are up in Pennsylvania. So what is in Richmond at the time? So Richmond by 1863 is a very well fortified place. There are 3 rings of fortifications, these inner detached star forts, this intermediate line, and then there's even an exterior line. And at the time, and by 1864 and 1865, when we get into the Richmond campaign, the Richmond-Petersburg campaign, it gets even stronger, but it's pretty strong in 1863. And you've got different commanders there, people that you may not have heard of: Arnold Elzey, John Wise, and Custis Lee, which is another of Lee's sons. Custis Lee was in charge of what they called the local defense forces in Richmond, largely like units from factory workers and things like that, militia essentially. But the main commander, who was kind of on the ground there at Richmond while Dix is making this plan, is this guy, Daniel Harvey Hill, which I'm sure a lot of you know about, D.H. Hill, and from the Carolinas, born in, I may be getting this wrong, born in South Carolina, but largely is kind of associated with North Carolina. So Hill's an interesting guy, very intelligent and fearless, a very good commander, but he's also prickly. And I think the best way to describe D.H. Hill is that he just didn't have very good sandbox skills, and so he did not work and play well with others, I guess. And so he kind of had this whimsical side to him. When you look at his official reports and things like that, there are a lot of kind of weird, entertaining things in them. My favorite is there was when he was a regimental commander early in the war, there was some kind of request, some kind of equipment was coming into camp, and his officers were like, well, we need to figure out, do we give this to the regimental band, or do we give it to, some other unit or whatever? And Hill, in his, written response, basically he writes, "Shooters before tutors." And so the band, lost out on that. But, in terms of like the sandbox skills, he was kind of this constant critic of everyone, and he managed to get crosswise with his superiors, in part probably because he couldn't help but comment in his official reports on the conduct of his superiors. Like, oh, well, that general probably should have done this, and if he had done this, this would have happened, it would have been better. Well, this apparently was not like a good recipe for success. And so after being with the Army of Northern Virginia, with Lee's army during a lot of the campaigning in 1862, in 1863 he finds himself in charge of Southern Virginia and North Carolina. But when Lee heads north, D.H. Hill is there to kind of fill in Richmond, which is a very fortuitous thing for the Confederates, because Hill, other than not getting along with people or maybe saying the wrong things, was an excellent commander. And just so in Richmond, basically, when you add it all up, there you've got kind of the local forces there, but you also have 3 veteran brigades, some that Lee had kind of left behind, Ransom, Cooks, and Jenkins, and then you've also got another brigade, Montgomery Corse's brigade, up Hanover Junction. And in all, you've got about 13,000 Confederates at Richmond. So you've got Dix with his 20,000 at White House, and you've got 13,000 in Richmond. So what happens? All right, so this slide says Stevens' diplomatic proposal, cut for time. We can talk about it later. Very interesting. The vice president of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, during this time suggests basically an expedition or a trip up to Washington to talk to the Lincoln administration about brokering some sort of agreement, peace. If you read Jefferson Davis and Alexander Stephens' prose, you really need a decoder ring for them because it's very hard to tell what they're talking about. They're especially here, they don't want to say things directly. But I think the conclusion of many was that they were looking for an all-out end to the war because this was the Confederacy had some recent victories. But we can get into more in that later in the Q&A if we have time, but we're not going to talk a whole lot about that. All right, so now we've got the first action from Dix's effort to burn the railroads, threaten Richmond, damage Richmond, capture Richmond. Who knows? But the first thing that he does is launch a cavalry raid, and that's commanded by a guy named Samuel Spear, Colonel Samuel Spear, and he led the 11th Pennsylvania, and he's one of those figures that you see a lot when you do a lot, research of different campaigns in the East. He's all over the place, but there's no biography of him. He just hasn't gained a lot of attention. But he is in charge of about 1,000 horsemen on June 25th. Okay, so let's just situate this in terms of the timeline. The orders from Halleck come on June 14th. Dix heads to Richmond, and he launches this on June 25th. On June 25th, Lee's army is moving into Maryland and soon into Pennsylvania, very strung out, so the forces are reaching different spots at different times. But all of this that's happening at Richmond that we're talking about is happening simultaneously with what's happening at Gettysburg, with the point being to damage Lee's efforts up there. So on the 25th, Spear's expedition Lee's White House landing, marches through Hanover County, north of Richmond, and reaches remember there were two railroads up from Richmond. He hits the one to the east here, the Virginia Central Railroad Bridge over the South Anna, just north of Hanover Courthouse there. And so, not going to get into tactical details here. There are many, many pages in the book if people are interested in that. But essentially, this force shows up, and guarding the bridge is a company of North Carolina troops from the 44th North Carolina from John Pettigrew's brigade. They have been left behind from the Gettysburg foray to guard the bridges around here. And so the companies are kind of, it's kind of split up into companies, and there are different bridges. There's one company that's about 50 men at this site, and you think that this engagement, this effort by Spear to burn this bridge would happen in about 10 minutes. It does not. It takes about 3 or 4 hours, and in part because these North Carolina troops there put up such a stand, and there we go. All right, my family's from North Carolina, so yeah, I'll allow that. So anyway, there's a lot of maneuvering. Finally, there's a kind of final assault on this small group. They do get reinforced by a company at the kind of near the end of the fight. But there's this desperate fight near the end. And when you look at movies sometimes, or paintings or whatever, you see a lot of hand-to-hand combat about, depicting things in the Civil War. And as a lot of you know, that just didn't really happen a lot. There wasn't a lot of that kind of close quarter fighting throughout the war. It did happen, but it didn't happen a lot. Well, it certainly happened at this little bridge north of, on the South Anna. And the casualties were very high for, especially for the small group of Confederates there. They were overwhelmed. Eventually, Spear burns that bridge, but he's lost precious time. And because in addition to that bridge, that bridge, he also wants to go up to there, to this bridge here, which is the RF&P, the Rappahannock-Fredericksburg, Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Rappahannock Railroad, Potomac. I'm getting all that wrong. Let's just call it RF&P. How about it? And this, if you're ever driving up between Richmond and Washington on 95, I feel for you. But also, if you cross the South Anna and you look to the left, you'll see a rail bridge there. That's the modern rail bridge, and the rail bridge during the Civil War was sited about 100 yards or so to the west of that. So next time you're up there, just make sure you spend most of your attention looking for the South Anna River. But that was that bridge, and but Spear wants to get there, but after this long engagement here at this other place, he receives reports that the other bridge has been reinforced, and so he decides not to go burn that. And he returns to the base at White House, where Dix is. So it's really only a partial victory. So one little footnote here. If I hit the left, does it go back? No. All right. All right, well, anyway. So what you should be looking at is a slide of Robert E. Lee's son, Rooney Lee, and there we go. Thank you. I apologize. Just south of that bridge is this plantation called Hickory Hill. It still exists today. It's a beautiful property. And Rooney Lee was one of Robert E. Lee's sons, as we talked about. He's the guy who owned White House Landing, where Dix has landed. A lot of coincidence here. And he was a cavalry commander in Lee's army. And at Brandy Station, which was the first engagement of the Gettysburg Campaign, he gets wounded in the thigh. And he comes back to this place, Hickory Hill, to convalesce. And Hickory Hill was owned by relatives of his wife. And so he is there when Spear is marching through. They march a couple hundred yards away from the place. Sometime during the day, during that raid, they find out that Rooney Lee is there, and they go and they capture him, and they take him back to White House. Now this creates a lot of unhappiness with the Confederates. They say it was unfair to take Lee, who was injured. And another interesting part of the story is that there are conflicting stories on how this actually happened. So the Lee family, particularly Rob Lee, in his reminiscences, talks about how the enslaved people at the farm helped hide the horses, and they helped do some things when these Union cavalrymen came and took Rooney Lee. However, there are other accounts on the federal side that said, well, the enslaved people were quite helpful. They came out and they said, hey, Robert E. Lee's son's right over there at that plantation. If you go and get him, you can capture him. So that is that's a very flip way of covering a lot of discussion that was in the book. But that was an interesting sidelight to it. Okay, so all right, so we'll get in, okay, our 3 hours, we still got 3 hours? Okay. So we're going to get into Dix's main, remember in the outline, we had the cavalry thing, and then we're going to have the infantry expedition, and we're going to get to that in a second. But before we do, I want to talk a little bit about kind of some sub-themes that I ran across when I was writing this book. And one of them is this notion of hard war, and that's the whole question about, the damage to civilian property, and what is civilian property, what civilian property is helping the enemy's war effort, and what is not, and where's the line drawn. And this is something, obviously, during the war that the views kind of evolved on this. But John Dix was very conservative on this issue, and he was very concerned about collateral harm to the civilian populace. And part of it was because he kind of found it simply immoral, and in part because he was one of those early in the war who expected that, well, if we treat the kind of Southern elite, if we treat them well in this conflict, then they'll see like what a bad idea it was to begin this rebellion, and they'll kind of drop the matter. And so he had this expectation that they might abandon the Confederacy, and return to the Union fold. And if you were, burning all of their property, that probably wouldn't help, that plan. So he was not, he was very concerned about it. So you see this throughout this operation, and also throughout the operation in Virginia. There are always these little raids going on all the time. And he is very strict in his orders about protecting property. And it's kind of a preoccupation with him, but he's kind of swimming against the tide, and a lot of his subordinates don't really agree with him. And so you see this, and we won't get into the details of the different raids and stuff, but you see this in the raids and the decisions that the officers need to make kind of on the ground, like, well, am I going to destroy this grain that, that we understand is being used by the Confederate commissary, or are we going to leave it alone because it's on this private property and things like that? So that's one issue, the issue of hard war. Another issue is the involvement of enslaved people in this campaign. And this is something that's covered in a lot of studies. I'm not breaking any new ground here on this or anything, but since no one had really studied this particular operation outside Richmond in any kind of detail, there have been a couple of articles in it, but no one had done a book-length treatment. A lot of the research for this project was pretty much ground that had not really been trod on before. And so what I found repeatedly was that the enslaved people in the area were constantly stepping up and meeting the Union officers as they're conducting these forays against the bridges and elsewhere, and they were providing assistance, and they were saying, they were identifying the Confederate troop locations, they were describing the road network, they're explaining the local geography, the rivers, that bridge is out, but there's a ford down here that you can use, that kind of thing. The other thing is that they were emancipating themselves in the thousands during this operation, which lasted about a week or two. And even in areas that had been visited by McClellan's troops the year before. And it kind of, to me, kind of underscored the complicated issues involved at this time with these people making their decision, whether to leave, where they are or not. If I leave, am I leaving behind people that I can't bring with me, and that kind of thing. So it was just kind of interesting to me. So those are two kind of sideline issues. So let's get back to what happens with now. So we've got the cavalry raid, burn that one bridge. There's still one bridge standing. Richmond's doing just fine, and so so Dix decides to go after the railroad again and get that second bridge, the RF&P. And what he does is he decides to launch a fairly large infantry raid or expedition, or what you want to call it. And so he gets that together. Now, at this time, this is something that the Blackberry Raid, not a lot of people know about it at this time. During this period, in late June, what Dix was doing outside of Richmond was a topic of much conversation in Washington with Lincoln's cabinet. And when you look at the diaries and things like that, there's a lot of talk, obviously, about Lee going to Pennsylvania. That is the big threat. But there's also a lot of talk about, well, what do we do with Dix in Richmond? Is he the right general? Do we want to try to capture Richmond with Lee up in Pennsylvania? Do we replace Dix with, say, Joseph Hooker, who resigns from the Army of the Potomac right before the Gettysburg Campaign? Or bring John Foster up from North Carolina, who's commander at the New Bern garrison. So that was kind of interesting to me, that this issue that we, have kind of really put aside, and it's something that no one talks about. At the time, this was a very important issue, and it was seen by some as a great opportunity, all of these troops outside of Richmond. So what does Dix do? He has these two columns. He sends half his force under Erasmus Keyes on a feint straight at Richmond. So that's the lower arrow there. And then he sends a slightly larger group under George Washington Getty to go burn that bridge. Now Keyes, his job is to go to this river, the Chickahominy, outside of Richmond, threaten Richmond, try to draw the Confederates' attention. And Keyes just does an absolutely horrible job at his task. And he gets out a couple of miles. He gets to this place called Crump's Crossroads, or Baltimore Crossroads, and he stops 5 miles away from where he's supposed to be going, and he sends all these bizarre notes back to Dix, saying things like, you know, gee, there are a lot of roads here at this intersection that I've stopped. There's one over here, there's one over here, there's one behind me. The Confederates, they could show up on any of these roads, and I would be in big trouble. You know, it's not quite like that, but it's almost like that, you know. And so it's kind of bizarre. And Dix he doesn't know what to do with Keyes. Dix is only a few miles away. When you see on the map, you can see from Keyes' position, he's a little south there. And when he's dawdling here, he's actually opening up a big lane right at White House and creating vulnerability for Dix. Well, so Keyes is not doing much, but D.H. Hill certainly is. And D.H. Hill receives reports that there's this Union column east of Richmond across the Chickahominy. He sends cavalry out there. He gets reports. He takes his 3 veteran brigades that we talked about earlier, and he goes out and he just smacks Keyes at Crump's Crossroads. Not a huge engagement, but you know, a significant engagement, and it just rocks Keyes back. Keyes goes to another little town, Talleysville, and just kind of sits there for the next couple of days. D.H. Hill looks at what's happening and says, oh, this is obviously a feint. This is a diversion. They're going after the railroads. And he has these interior lines to, there's Hill hitting Keyes at Crump's Crossroads. And D.H. Hill has what they call the interior lines and can move his troops up to those railroads quickly. So that's the first prong. Keyes does not go well. The second prong, Getty's expedition. He has 10,000 men, and he marches through the counties north of Richmond, and his movement is also a little baffling. He follows what I call kind of a breadcrumb strategy. He's got 10,000 men. He drops 1,000 off at this bridge. He drops 2,000 off at some farm. It's a big, beautiful farm, but he drops them off there. And then he gets to Hanover Courthouse, and he drops some more men off, and then he drops himself off at Hanover Courthouse. And so, and these guys, this is the expedition that's supposed to go to that second bridge, the one that you're going to look at when you go over I-95. And he is, when the troops finally arrive there, and this is all happening on, as it says up there, July, 1st, 2nd, 3rd. We all know what that is. That's when the fighting's happening at Gettysburg. And his troops arrive, his expedition without him, arrive at that bridge on July 4th in the evening there. Now, to be fair to Getty, he doesn't explain why he does this, but during this time, it was very, very hot in Virginia. It was about, it was like in the 90s. And so during the first couple of days of Getty's march to that bridge, many, many men get sick from sunstroke, and several dozen die, maybe more. In order to as they're marching along, they would take breaks, and on the sides of the road at this time, the blackberry bushes were full of blackberries. And so the men would eat the blackberries while they were taking breaks. And when they came back from this expedition, they called it the Blackberry Raid. And so that's why it's called the Blackberry Raid. So it is possible that Getty was also suffering from the heat and could not follow the troops to the target, but we don't really know. When they get to the target that evening, the command has shifted to this very young officer, Robert Foster. He's 26 years old, not a very well-known officer. He gets there, he's got about 5,000 men, and they're looking to challenge this bridge. And instead of sending out the bulk of his troops, he sends out 2 companies from a fairly new New York regiment, a couple hundred men maybe. They go out, they do not gain success, and he decides, well, okay, I'll reinforce them. and he reinforces them with 2 more companies. And needless to say, this effort is a failure, and they do not burn this bridge. The whole thing is a story of failure. We talked about that at the beginning. So Getty's expedition there is unsuccessful. He withdraws, goes back to White House Landing. Now, the other issues. Remember at the beginning there was, I didn't say this would be on the quiz, but there were these 3 prongs, right, from Halleck's operation. One was the Blackberry Raid that we've been talking about. The other was the operation in West Virginia, and then the other one was the operation in North Carolina. Now, in North Carolina, John Foster does launch a raid, and just a few days after Gettysburg, and he does end up destroying portions of the track up at Warsaw, which is not far from here. It's north about 90 miles. And so he burns track there. And then in West Virginia, another kind of baffling piece of the story, the people in charge in West Virginia receive Halleck's orders to go damage the Tennessee connection, in early June, mid-June. They don't get around to it until late July, but they eventually attack a little place called Wytheville out there in the west, but that is not successful either. The raid in North Carolina, they do destroy some track, and this is, to me, kind of an interesting thing in this project, because there were lots of issues about burning bridges, destroying track, trying to get a result from it. And really, when you look at the details, a lot of these raids were not very successful because the tracks were repaired very, very quickly, within days sometimes. And sometimes very large bridges would be repaired in just a few days. And so really the takeaway for me was these raids would only be successful if they were kind of impeccably timed to coincide with some very important movement or something, or if they involved like some kind of permanent lodgment at the spot where you were trying to destroy the railroad. And so that was, so those were those 2 other operations that I mentioned earlier. So Halleck is very, he's not very engaged in managing these 3 operations that he sets out that look kind of interesting, right? When I first put the slide up, yeah, like you cut those railroads and then you attack Richmond, maybe you capture Richmond and you destroy those railroads, that's going to hurt Lee. Well, Halleck has his hands full with dealing with Joseph Hooker throughout June, who is kind of his star is quickly falling out of the sky. And so Halleck is involved with that. And then when George Meade takes over in charge of the Army of the Potomac, right before the fighting at Gettysburg, Halleck is pretty much spending all his time. You look at the records, and there's a dispatch like every hour between those 2. So Halleck, it doesn't have his eyes on Virginia, and he's talking to Meade every hour. He's talking to Dix maybe every 5 days. And then he's sending kind of confusing things like, oh, have you attacked Richmond yet? In a couple of days, oh, I'm not sure, I want you to attack Richmond. It was just not very well managed. And so that's kind of what you get with the end there with Halleck. Now, the one kind of interesting question is like, well, they did burn this bridge, did this have an effect on Lee? And I spent a lot of time going down a lot of rabbit holes trying to figure out, well, did this affect the trains that were going up to the valley, to Stanton? Stanton was the main kind of railhead Lee was using because the roads along the valley were kind of shielded by the Blue Ridge there. And there are reports from Stanton that the trains haven't run in a week or 2 or whatever because that line was broken. Now, there are lots of ways around a burned bridge. You can transport stuff across the river. You could use the other rail line, but it did appear to make some impact. But the most important thing is that, Lee fights this one large battle in Pennsylvania, and then he comes back. And so he never really has a huge problem in terms of ammunition shortage. If he had been up there for longer or had to fight another battle or a series of engagements, then this may have had an impact. If Dix and his people had managed to destroy that other bridge, it would definitely have had an impact. So that's kind of that's all speculative, but this could have had a big impact on what was going on. I think the bottom line, though, is the interesting part to me is this notion that you had this fairly large federal force outside of Richmond, and you really didn't get any results from it. And the results, the decision-making by Dix and his subordinates are kind of emblematic of a lot of Union generals early in the war, very cautious, not because they were just cautious by nature, in my view, but because, you know, they felt that losing badly on the battlefield would be a really bad thing for the Union cause politically. And so they had this kind of ingrained cautiousness from that. And that obviously evolved and changed as new commanders came in over the war. But this guy, Gustavus Vasa Fox, who was kind of the second in charge at the Navy, he thought that there was great opportunity from this operation that Dix was conducting. And he said, his quote is, "Every rash act of this war has been crowned with success, and here is the most glorious opportunity ever afforded, and we're not taking advantage of it," basically. But D.H. Hill, our buddy D.H. Hill, for his part, he says he's writing to Davis a couple of days after the operation, and Getty returns to Dix and White House Landing, and they stay there for a few days. And D.H. Hill writes it, and he says, "The design on Richmond was not a feint, but a feint." So, all right, well, I think that's all I've got now. Just so I don't have any books to sell, but I did ask the press to, they have a discount code if anybody wants to go to University Press of Kansas website, and you put in 24NCRT, you'll get 40% off and free shipping. So if you want to, and that's a lot cheaper than you'll get it anywhere. So anyway, all right, well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Hampton, and you brought it in under 3 hours.
Right, yeah, the 3 hours.
So we do appreciate
Yes.
that. Do we have some questions now for our Q&A for Hampton? And we have one back here. They're going to make me get my steps in tonight. I do have my watch on, so it's counting everyone.
So after this campaign, what happened with Dix that he got a fort named after him?
What's that?
After this campaign, what distinguished Dix to get a fort named after him?
So Dix is, you know, he's not the person you'd want as the kind of combat commander, but he was an excellent administrator. And so, you know, you can't cover all the aspects. So I probably wasn't fair enough to him. But he did a very good job of administering all the stuff that was going down and happening in Norfolk. And right after this campaign, he was sent to New York to help deal with the kind of aftermath of the draft riots there. And he remained there. I think it's called the Department of the East, something like that. He remained there the rest of the war, and I think, you know, generally considered to have done a very good job of managing things up there. And so I don't think anyone felt that Dix was, you know, a big failure or anything like that. This particular thing, operation, he did get some flack for it. He got in a big argument with Halleck that I didn't talk a lot about those words, you know, am I supposed to attack Richmond or whatever near the end. But generally, he went on to do good things.
Other questions? Yes. They are going to make me get my steps in.
If there was one or two bridges that if the campaign was successful in doing, what would have been your estimation of making success?
Yeah, I think and what would have been the effect of destroying the two bridges?
Two bridges or any bridge?
Yeah, I think that it just would have been, you know, the counterfactual is always a difficult place to go out on the thin ice, but generally you would have had this this interruption of the rail lines, and so it would have been harder to get supplies up to Lee. So if Lee comes back across the river or stays up there and it does significant fighting, then it's very hard to get to, you know, replenish the cartridge boxes and the limber chests and that kind of thing. Now, there are other railroads in the state. They use different gauges. They could have gone around the long way. They could have, you know, like I said, moved stuff over rivers and stuff like that. So it would have had an impact, but the impact it would have had, it's kind of hard to tell. You had a question, yeah.
Is there any place other than the University of Kansas?
Yeah, you can buy this book, most anywhere. I always urge people to buy it directly from the press. University Press of Kansas, like UNC Press or, you know, whatever, is a, you know, nonprofit academic press. So I like to, you know, I have generally published with those different presses, so I encourage people to order it from there.
What happened to Rooney Lee?
So Rooney Lee is captured, and there's a lot of controversy about, he gets all wrapped up in the disintegration of the kind of the prisoner of war cartel, which was actually negotiated by Dix and D.H. Hill, the Dix-Hill cartel. And so he eventually does return to the Army, but not after a very long time. And there are threats and counter threats about executing prisoners and things like that. It's kind of a mess.
You said that the bridges were burned, but they really didn't destroy the rails on that. And when Sherman marched to the sea, they were pulling up the rails and the Sherman bow ties.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Is there a reason why?
Well, so at the Virginia Central, they burned the bridge there. They didn't have time to burn a lot of the rails, but there was, during the larger infantry expedition, there was a cavalry detachment that goes to Ashland, and they do destroy some of the rails there. So there wasn't any kind of intention to leave the rails alone and only focus on the bridge. But the bridge was obviously harder to repair than the rails, so that's their first target.
Other questions? Well, thank you, Hampton.
All right, thanks so much for having me.